Hello there, welcome to the tutorial. My name is Payal Sinha. I'm an artist, an art educator, and a Skillshare top teacher based in Bahrain. Today, we are going to be painting a beautiful autumn-inspired landscape together using my favorite medium, that is gouache. Before we dive into the painting process, I wanted to take a moment and give you a brief about what you can expect from this tutorial. We'll start off by talking about the art materials that you need to keep with you when we are painting, and then move on to using a reference image as a guide for the sketch and the painting process. If you would like, you can download the reference image and keep that with you for reference, or you can just follow me along. Next, we will start the painting process, and the entire process is in like a step-by-step format. So everything is explained in detail and in real time. So you'll know all about the choices that I make for the painting, the brush strokes that I make, and the colors that I mix. So everything is explained in detail here. By the end of this tutorial, you'll have a beautiful landscape painting with you that you're going to be so proud of. So if this is interesting, then without wasting any more time, let's get started with the painting process. Let us talk about all the art materials that I'll be using. So for the paper, I'll be using a 300 GSM cold pressed paper, which works perfectly for my style of painting. But you can use any paper that you have with you. Gouache is very versatile like that. For the paints, I'll be using my Winsor & Newton gouache paints. I love the consistency of the paint and they are my #1 choice for the gouache paints. I've mentioned the shades. You can use the shades that I've mentioned exactly or something similar or along the same lines. For the brushes, I'll be using a flat size 10, round size 4 and 0, and a spoiled brush, that is an old brush that has lost its shape. You can use that brush for beautiful leaf textures. Next, I have a mixing palette, some tissues, 2 jars of water, masking tape, and a flat board to tape down my paper on. So these are all the materials that you need. Once you're ready with it, we are going to start the painting process. So I've taped on my paper on all 4 sides on my flat board and taken out all the colors that I mentioned earlier. So I've got my warm colors, that is my yellow, orange, along with that I have blue, black and white on my palette as well. And here are the 2 jars of water. One's for rinsing your brush and one is for fresh clean water. I've got the brushes here. You can see the flat brush, the 2 round brushes that I mentioned, and I'll be using the flat brush for the backgrounds. You can use a larger size here as well, but I'll be using the size 10 itself. I've got my round brushes, and the last brush that you see is the one that I was talking about for the texture. You can see how it's lost its shape, but it works perfectly when you want to create those beautiful leafy textures in your painting. So let us start with the sketch first. You're seeing the reference image that I'm using on the left side of this video. You can download this reference image as well and keep it with you, but if you don't want to, it's fine. It's completely fine. You can just follow me along. I'm going to be explaining everything, so it does not make that much sense if you want to keep the reference image with you or not. You can just follow me along. So the basic idea that we're going for here is sketching out all the different mountains that you're seeing. Now in the reference image, you can see how there are series of mountains, right? The tiniest one or the smallest one that you're seeing is really far away, and that's why you're seeing only a part of it or a very small area of it, and it has a bunch of mountains in front of it. So that's exactly what we are sketching. Now if you're not going to sketch it out exactly the way you want in a reference image, then you can always just create your own versions of it. I tend to look at the reference image and create my own versions as I go. So it's not like I'm trying to create an exact replica of the mountains that I'm seeing, but I know for a fact that there are a series of mountains back there and they're kind of in front of each other. I'm trying to understand the positioning of them and the surface area that we're seeing, so that when I sketch it out, I'm kind of creating that kind of essence and that kind of flow in it. So now that I'm done with the smaller mountains, which I don't tend to pay a very important attention to or a lot of attention to because they're still further away, and I focus more on the ones that I'm seeing in the front. So you'll see the mountains that I'm seeing in the front, they are very similar to the reference image on the left side. So we've got one coming down from right to left, and we've got one in front of it which you're seeing as a slighter brownish shade, and then we've got the one very close to us that is in the middle, which is receiving a lot of light from the right side. We will capture the lights differently as we go. And then obviously the last one that we're seeing is the one with trees, where you're seeing a lot of texture of the different leaves of different warm fall colors or autumn colors. So we're going to just capture that in that exact manner. And then obviously at the very bottom we've got a tree that's very close to us, right? And the leaves appear to be a lot bigger. From the right side, we've got some branches and leaves that we will focus more on once we're done with everything in the background, because even if we were to sketch it out, it would get covered. So I'm not going to pay that much attention to that. I will sketch that later as we go. So let's start with the painting process. When you're painting something like this, you want to start off with the sky and then slowly move down. So for the sky, you can see how we had a beautiful pastel color in the sky. It's not too dark. It's a beautiful, I would say, like a sunset time. It's moving towards it, but it's not entirely sunset time yet. It's like that afternoonish time. So I'm going to go for this blue shade, which is a mix of Prussian blue and white. So a lot of white and very little Prussian blue. And I'm going to add that at the top of the paper, top of the sky area, and slightly bring it down. Now, if you've painted with gouache, you know what the consistency feels like. But if you're new to the medium, then just know that you're going for a creamy consistency, but not something that's too thick. You want to have like a medium consistency, which is very workable. Now to my mix, I've added a bit of my primary red color, and a bit more white and blue was there in it from before. So you get this slight purplish color. We don't want the purple to be very overpowering. That's why I've added just tiny amount of red in it, so that when I blend it out, it's that beautiful transition from purple to the blue color. Next, I'm going to mix white and yellow together to get a beautiful lighter shade of yellow, or a pastel shade of yellow, and that's going to be the color that I use. Now, if you're painting with blue and you want to switch to yellow, you have to make sure that your brush needs to be completely clean and not have any shades of blue on it, because if you do have it, your yellow is going to turn slightly green, or it's going to kind of get muddy. So you want to make sure that you're cleaning your brush along the way, and that's why the double rinsing part plays a very important role. Once you've laid out the blue and the yellow, you can see how I left a tiny space or a small area in between them, right? And now I'm using white to blend the yellow and the blue together. Now, based on color theory, if you were to mix two primary colors, they are going to make a secondary color. So we know yellow and blue are primary colors, and if I were to directly mix them, I would get a green shade. Now, what is the shade that you don't see in the sky? That is green, clearly. So we don't want the green. And to avoid that kind of mistakes in your painting, especially when you're painting skies, you want to make sure that you leave a good amount of space in between those two primary colors and use white to kind of blend them with one another, so that there's a beautiful transition from the yellow to the blue, and in between that transition you have very light mix of blue and yellow coming in together, and it's not very evidently green. I like the way my sky looks, so I'm just gonna let this dry for now. Alright, so now that our sky is completely dried up, I love the blend in the sky, we are going to go ahead and start painting the mountains. Now for painting these mountains, you are going to be creating a shade which is lighter first. So to my yellow mix, I'm just adding a bit of green, a bit of black and white to get this grayish color, which still has a yellowish undertone to it, if that were to make sense. Just because I want to preserve that yellow color that it's, getting from the sky that is there behind it, or the color that's behind it. So I want to have that yellowish color to the gray that I'm mixing. And I'm getting this really light color because I've added a lot of white in it. The basic idea is that you start with a lighter shade on the top and then slowly transition to the darker color as you come closer to the bottom. So I'm starting off with this color. You're just going to load up your shade on your round brush and focus more on the edges first. So I've put that on the edge and I'm going to fill the space out, and then just using a wet brush. So I'm just loading my brush up with some water. I'm going to bring the color down. So you want this consistency to be slightly lighter. Now the question is, why do you do that, right? Why do you want the tip to be of a different consistency and the bottom portion to be of a different consistency. The idea is that you want to create that misty effect, and that works really well, and I've tried this out for myself as well. It works really well for me, and in my opinion, when the consistency is lighter, the tip when it dries it's a bit darker, and then that misty effect comes in when it's dry. So it might not appear instantly, but once it dries it makes a lot more sense. I like the first blend of the mountain that we have, so we're going to let this dry completely and then move on to the next one. So here the mountain is dried. You can see how there's not that flat effect. That's the basic idea. We don't want it to be flat. Now I'm just adding a little bit of that darker color that I have on my palette into my mix, just to slightly deepen the color. Again, with my brush, carefully I'm going to add that, focusing more on the tip, and it's not like you're just outlining it. You want to cover almost half of that area using your darker color, and then once you have covered almost like the top half of your mountain, you can add a bit of water and load up the color itself. You can load up the color, you can reactivate the paint. That's why gouache is versatile, right? You can reactivate the surface even once it's dry, and if it's not moving a lot or budging a lot, you can just add the color with a thinner consistency on top. Now what this does is, again, like I mentioned, it will create that sort of misty effect, and your mountains won't look very flat. They will have that darker and lighter kind of flow in it, and it looks a lot better when it's not flat, basically. So that's the idea that we're going with. I like the way this looks, so I'm going to let this dry now. Alright, so now that this has dried, you can see how the mountain is not flat, and that is exactly what we're going for, the basic idea that we're going for. And again, we are going to darken the color. So as we transition, we're going to slightly darken it. Now, to get a beautiful series of mountains, and especially when you're working with something that has many, like more than 4 or 5 consecutive mountains, the transition that you're bringing in the shades needs to be very, I would say, light. And light in the sense, you don't want to make it so evident where you have like 4 different shades of gray and it varies by a lot. You don't want that. You want it to be very seamless. So the amount of black that you're adding, or the amount of darker color that you're adding to it, that is your black and blue basically. You want to make sure that you're doing it very slowly, that transition is coming in very slowly, because you don't want it to appear very, on the opposites of the spectrum, or on the color wheel, right? You don't want it to be like different shades of the tonal value. I mean, I'm saying a lot of words. I hope that's making sense. But in very, very simplified terms, you don't want the color to differ by a lot. You want to have very slow transitions in the colors that you're mixing, so that the gray that's behind it is just slightly lighter than the one that you're putting in front. Now that I'm done with this, I like the way it looks. I'm going to move on to my next one. And you can see how that misty effect is coming in, right? Mountains don't look flat, and the the tip of the mountain looks a little bit darker, and then you've got that lighter color at the bottom. So that's exactly how you want it to be. Now I'm mixing another gray shade, trying to make sure that this one is again slightly darker than the one that I just put before that, and then move on to the next one. So I'm adding a bit of yellow again, because I still wanted to have that yellowish undertone in it, and it's a very, very light amount of yellow, very little amount of yellow. So make sure that you're just adding a little bit of yellow. So again, going ahead with my round brush, I'm adding that on the top, making sure that I have the top of the mountain covered nicely. It's nice and thick and dark. And then as I transition down, I will just use the same brush. I'm not cleansing the brush or anything. I'm just loading it up with a little bit of water so that I can reactivate the paint. And using the paint that's also on my brush, I can spread and cover the area that I'm seeing, and the area of the mountains that I'm seeing. So I'm just going to go ahead and cover this portion entirely. Now over here, the process is very repetitive. So after this mountain dries, I'm going to increase the step by a little bit. Once this dries, we are going to go ahead and cover, I would say, 2 more mountains or 3 more mountains with the same kind of color. And I mean, not the same color, but the same pattern, in which you're just slightly increasing the intensity of it, the darkness of it, and covering up the entire surface in that similar manner. So you first add the tip, and then you add water and just reactivate the surface and fill up the entire area. When you are painting these mountains, one thing to keep in mind is you don't want to make your strokes very flat. The more unevenness you bring in it, the more character you build into it. So your mountains are not very flat, right? It's not like very triangular and just up and down movements, right? It has a little bit of ridges, a little bit of ups and downs. Maybe the mountain has trees. So you want to kind of bring all of those things in account when you're painting something like this. You want that to be very uneven and just have those ridges and top ups and downs in your mountains. Now once I'm done with this beautiful transition of different shades of gray and like the bluish gray, I'm going to mix the darker color. So this one is a mix of black, blue, and a bit of white, and you can see how it's very evidently darker than the others that I've laid out, but it's not too dark that it's black. And I'm going to go ahead and start making these vertical strokes right next to one another, and this just kind of shows that my area, my mountain, has some trees on it that I'm not entirely seeing very well, and I just have this ups and downs in it. So I'm just making vertical strokes very close to one another, and you can see how I'm also varying the sizes of it and the lengths of it, so they don't look very flat. And I'm also adding some in the middle. I'm also lifting paint wherever I feel like I've added too much of the darker color, so that variation looks a lot better. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up, and once it dries, we'll move on to an entirely different color for the mountains. Alright, so the last three mountains and the colors that we have to use are different from the ones that we've been using so far. So into my same mix, I'm adding a bit of black and a lot of brown color, which is my burnt umber shade. And this is a swatch that I get, which is a very dark shade of brown. So I'm going to use this color and fill up this entire section, again using these short vertical strokes that are kind of laid out next to one another, but again varying in the ups and downs and the sizes of it, and also, you know, it's not very flat. I'm using a flat brush here to kind of just go ahead and re-wet the surface or prep the surface for the beautiful textured effect that we want to create, and just to get the paint flowing. And when the paint actually flows this way, you get that unevenness that we're looking for. So instead of using our brush dipped in water and covering the surface, the paper is already wet, so you're able to create that bloomed out effect in your paint, and you can move the paint around. And since gouache, you know, is very similar to watercolors in that sense, so it still behaves with those properties. Along with this dark brown color, I'm loading my brush with a bit of orange. I haven't cleaned my brush, and that's why the orange is not that overpowering. And I'm going to go ahead and create some taps in the areas that are at the bottom, so that I have different variations of color. Now over here the color does not look very intense, and it isn't very intense. And once I add the orange, I've also gone ahead with the darker color. So you'll just have to go to and fro with your strokes to see how you are creating that unevenness, but it's also not very evident. Once this dries completely, we'll move on to the next one. Again, over here we're going for a very similar color palette. We could slightly make the color a bit darker, which means a brown and a lot more black into the same mix. And then we're going to go ahead and again create these vertical strokes and add that in. Before we go ahead and do that, I've wet the surface, just prepped it so that my colors kind of nicely flow and go where the water is. So I'm going to go ahead and start creating those vertical strokes again, and you can clearly see how this color appears darker. Now, would you say that this color is darker, or just that the bottom portion from the previous one is lighter, right? That's why the water plays a very important role, because it creates that misty effect, and it also lets the color to dry down a little bit lighter as well. And I'm going to go ahead and just cover this entire surface again with this darker color. And once I'm done with that, I'll go ahead and load up my brush with a bit of orange. I've cleaned my brush here, and I'm going to go ahead and just add in some taps. So you can do that with orange, you can do that with brown. You can see how creating these taps creates this illusion of trees that are there on the mountains without having to really work on the details very much. And that's what we want to do, because this is at a distance. You don't really have to work so much on the detailing part, but rather just create some brush strokes and textures that look very similar to trees on the mountains. So that's how you work around painting landscape images. You don't always have to work on the details exactly as you're seeing in your reference image, but rather work on creating textures and effects that are very similar to what you're seeing in the picture. I'm going to go ahead and just add in some darker strokes, some lighter strokes, just to create that variation. It's not just dark on the top and light at the bottom. So I'm adding some darker strokes at the bottom as well. Once this dries, you're going to let it, dry completely. And once it dries, we'll move on to the next one. So the last one has to be a lot darker. We're seeing a lot of trees there, so we'll have to work a lot with the textures of that area. So before we go ahead and paint that entire thing, I'm going to go ahead and prep my surface. So using my flood brush, I've added water just to wet the surface so that it's easier for me as I move with the brush strokes. Over here, I'm going to create a mix of my black color and my burnt umber color. So we want the base to be very dark, right? And on which we will rest browns and oranges and all the other fall colors or the autumn colors, so that they blend out a lot better and stand out a lot more. And for that, we need our base to be very dark. So I'm going to go ahead and just cover this entire section first, the bottom section first, with my very, very dark color that I have. And then I'm going to slowly move it upwards. So you can see how, because the paper was prepped from before it had water, I didn't really have to work so much on the blending process. I just added it and moved my paint around, and it creates that beautiful effect where the paint just goes with the water. The color that is on the top is just a little bit of black and a lot more of the browner color, and I'm again adding that in and moving it downwards. You can clearly see how there's a slight difference in the color. The one that I'm adding on top is just a lot more browner as compared to what I added at the bottom. But make sure that you're getting in all those white spaces that you're seeing, and your strokes are not flat. You want your strokes to be very up and down and have a lot of ridges so that it brings out the natural form in which the colors would look. Next, I'm switching to my like a spoiled brush for the texture, and I'm using my orange color and I'm just tapping it in. Now I will give you a closer view of how I'm doing this, because I have to keep my brush perpendicular to the paper. That sometimes ends up interfering with the overhead shots. So I will give you a closer look as to what I'm going for. But before the paint completely dries, I want to add a layer first so that it kind of blends into the paint that's already there, the wet paint that's already there, and then we'll slowly add in more textures on the top. So I'm going with this orange color and a mix of brown color in certain places, and I'm just adding some like taps and textures. Now this spoiled brush, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, has its bristles everywhere, the hairs everywhere, and because it's spread out, when you load up your brush and tap it perpendicular or at a obtuse angle, or something like that, it creates that effect in which you see little dots from different directions, which works perfectly when you want to show trees at a distance and show textures of trees and the leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and create some more taps. I'm not focusing more on the extreme bottom of this because we have a lot of trees in that area with slightly bigger textures. So you don't have to finish the ones at the extreme bottom. But again, you slowly want to still bring it till the bottom, but just not extreme bottom. So I'm going to give you a closer look of the taps. This will help you understand the way in which this texture is created, and while the paint is still wet, how it does not really stand out so much and slightly blends in with the paint at the bottom. So you can see how this tap has created this effect. I'm not really even working on the branches and things like that. I'm just creating taps, and this tap majorly varies with the darker brown being at the top, at the bottom or in the middle, because the black is at the bottom. So it's in the middle, and the orange taps and the slightly lighter taps that I'll add will be the color that rests on top of it. So along with all your darker colors, you are going to add in some lighter colors on it as well. So while this is drying, because gouache is a very fast drying medium, you can, work quickly. You don't really have to wait for the layer to dry entirely. I'm loading my brush with some orange and creating some taps again, and you can see how it creates that beautiful texture for your trees and your leaves. So especially when you're painting fall paintings or autumn paintings, I end up using a lot of this brush for the texture, especially when I want to show like highway paintings and you've got trees on the sides and you've got a lot of different shades in play as well. This type of texture work works best. So I wanted to put in a little bit of that in my painting today as well, so you are familiar with that. And if you've been following me on Instagram, you know how I've done so much of these autumn paintings in which I've used similar texture. And it's not just for autumn, I would say it also works for a lot of for, if you're painting, let's say, a garden or a forest, you can still use this type of texture work in those paintings as well. So you're going to slowly just transition, play with different colors. If you'd like to add some yellow in it, feel free to do that as well. You don't have to stop at orange. You can add in a slightly lighter color, which is a yellow color on top, as some strokes, as some highlights on it, and feel free to kind of enjoy adding your own element into the painting as well. You have full creative freedom of changing things as you like, because you're here just to learn how to proceed with paintings and how to approach paintings like these. Now, once this painting is completely dry and the layer has completely dried up, it's time for us to add the trees that we're seeing at the bottom. So I'm going to switch to my size 0 brush because it gives me that precise thin strokes that I want. And with black color, which is my black shade, I'm going to go ahead and create a bunch of branches. Now, if you're not familiar with creating branches, I would suggest you practice this a little bit on a rough piece of paper, because you want to extend one branch and then have a lot of sub branches on it. And since we're actually not doing a lot of branch work, it's still okay, because major part of this just gets covered with the leaves, because this tree has a lot of leaves of different colors. So you don't really have to have that perfect branch work here. You just need to create a few branches and a few, I would say at a distance also looks like trunk. So just a few of those, and then we are going to cover entirely that area with a bunch of leaves. So once this layer or the branch layer has dried up, it's time for us to move on to creating some textures for the leaves as well. So you can pause here and also have a closer look at the branches, and once you're done with that, I'm going to start adding leaves to it. Again, I'm using my spoiled brush here, which has beautiful textures to it, and you can use a fan brush here if you are more comfortable with that. And I'm using my burnt umber color first to act as the base, to which later on I will add a lighter color and maybe add in some yellow strokes as well. So I'll see how I feel about that and then go about that as I paint. So I'm just going to go ahead and tap in the texture first. So you can see how I'm just covering up the entire section. You can also play around with the shape of the tree, make it how you want it to look, have full creative freedom here to change things if you'd like. If you don't want to add this type of tree, you can also add pine trees. So that'll be a lot easier. You'll just be adding a bunch of pine trees in the bottom. Again, you are free to add things the way you want to and change things accordingly. I'm going to go ahead and just add in the brown strokes first. Once I'm done laying out the browns, I'm mixing a little mix of brown and my cadmium orange, which is my burnt umber and cadmium orange. And this mix of color is a beautiful, I would say, orange brownish color. So it's not very bright orange, but at the same time it goes with the flow. So you lay out this color first, and then maybe on top you could add in a brighter orange to create highlights. So you're always going to be moving in different shades. So first, let's say the darker color, then you have the let's say black being the first color, and then you have the brown, which is the darkest color, to which you add in your medium colors, which is like the orange that we're adding. And then when you want to add highlights, like more highlights to it, you could add in a lighter color. So you always want to proceed in that format. We are moving with the darkest to the lighter color, because we're working with gouache, we have to work in that format, and that creates that beautiful bush-like effect, makes sure that your trees look fuller. Again, the shape of the trees can be different, but the process somehow remains the same. Now that I'm done with this orange color, you can see how it dried out to be slightly lighter, but not entirely light, right? You're still seeing that in shades of brown. Next, I'm creating a mix of my orange and a bit of yellow color in it. So this is the mix that I get. It's still orange, but it has a hint of yellow in it. And then I'm going to be using my brush to create in some more textures. So this one, as you can clearly see, has dried out to be, or when you apply it, it looks lighter, right? So you want to make sure that you want to put it on top, because we're assuming that the light is falling on this entire surface in that manner. Again, the light source plays an important role. In the image, it shows that it's coming from the right top corner section. So that's exactly how I am putting the light in focus here as well, assuming that the light is falling in that same angle. So I'm just adding this all towards the top part of my painting. So as you go, you'll add more textures, see how it looks. Depending on which, you will add more textures if needed, a different color texture if needed. Now that I'm done creating these strokes, I'm just going to add in a few more, but I'm overall done. And you can see how major part of the branches are hidden, right? Major part of it are hidden, so we'll also have to kind of bring that into play again. I'm just making sure that I create some strokes at the bottom section as well, so it's not just at the top, and you have some leaves and some details for the foliage at that section as well. And once I'm done with that, switching to my size 0 brush again and bringing out some strokes for the branches, just to show that you're seeing those at the top as well, and it's not just the branches at the bottom. So you're just going to create in some branch effects wherever necessary. There's no particular order in which I'm doing it. I'm just adding a few branches here and there just to bring that into play. And once you add in the branches, you're going to again add some texture to cover those very evident branches. So right now it looks like it's resting on top of my foliage. So you want to kind of sandwich that between the previous layer and the layer that's now, that is your branch layer. And then I'm going to switch back to my orange color and add in some textures here and there again, so that I kind of cover up those branches, not entirely, but just very, very slightly. So it doesn't look like the branches are resting on top of the previous foliage strokes that we made. So go ahead and create that beautiful sandwich between those two layers. And once you're done with that, we are pretty much done with the foliage section here. And then we'll focus on the branches that are coming from the right side of the painting. Alright, so I'm switching to my pencil now, and I've put the reference image in play again on the left side of the screen. So you're able to see that how I'm creating the branches based on what's in the reference image. Now your branches don't have to be exactly placed in the same manner as you're seeing in the reference image. You can change a few things. You can put some going up, some going down. It doesn't have to be entirely like the reference image. For the branches as well as the leaf that you're seeing in there, the leaves, they don't have to be exactly like that. Another thing that you'll notice in the reference image and the painting is the colors appear to be different, and that's why I said your colors can be different. You are just getting inspired from the reference image and not entirely copying it. Once I'm happy with the way the sketch for the branches look, I'm going to go ahead and create a beautiful dark mix of my brown color with a bit of black. So here's a mix of the color that I get. And the first thing that I'm going to do is outline all the branches. Now I tend to sketch out the branches, but as I start painting, I tend to change things here and there. But you can carefully just outline the branches that you're seeing. So I'm going to go ahead and do exactly that. I am going to go over the branches that I've just painted, and you can add in some extra sub branches, some tinier branches as you go. Since we have a lot of leaves to add here, I'm not focusing a lot on the tinier branches. I am adding a few, but I'm not adding that many because I don't have to focus on that entirely. I have to focus more on the leaves that I will add later on, but just have some main branches and a few sub branches and some tinier ones here and there. So we're going to go ahead and paint all our branches first. Like I mentioned earlier, I do tend to change the branches as I go. I don't entirely follow my sketch. I raise them later on, but you are free to, create the branches as you'd like. You don't have to follow entirely the reference image, or even me for that matter. You can add the branches based on how you would like it. One trick that I like to keep in mind when I'm painting these branches are I want to keep my brush very perpendicular to the paper. That gives me control over the amount of pressure that I'm applying, and I also make sure that I'm just using the tip of my brush for creating these branches. The reason being, because these branches vary a lot in the sizes, using it perpendicular to the paper, like I mentioned, gives me control over the pressure. And also I use the tip, and when I apply more pressure, I get those thicker brush strokes. And when I just lightly brush my brush over the tip of my brush over the paper, it creates those beautiful thin strokes. So that's something that I keep in mind when I'm painting these branches. And it's not just for branches that I tend to use the idea of keeping my brush perpendicular. I tend to do that for a lot of different things, but again, it really helps me with the control of my brush. So if you're someone who struggles with the amount of pressure that you're applying and you're not entirely sure how to do it, I would suggest you try creating a bunch of different strokes. Try keeping it, try keeping the brush perpendicular to the paper so that you have more control over it, and create a bunch of strokes and see what it works and how it works. Coming back to this, I am done with the branches, so I'm going to leave it to dry for a bit, and while that's drying, I'll just clean my brush and switch to my spoilt brush for a bit of texture. Now in the reference image, since this branch section is very close to the observer, the leaves appear to have a bigger shape, correct? So we will be focusing on that, but before we go ahead and do that, we will focus on creating a bit of texture in the background so that our leaves can nicely rest on top of it and create a more defined look. So right now you can see how adding these strokes does not entirely go with the branches, right? It looks a little bit awkward. So if I were to use a bigger brush for texture, it would be a lot better and it would give me a lot more defined effect. But right now they are very fine to my liking. But I'm still going to go ahead and create that texture just to give the strokes that I make later a base on which it will rest, and then I can add in my colors based on that. So I'm going to go ahead and add in the texture everywhere. Make sure that you're not entirely covering your branches, because you don't want to do that. You want to show your branches a little bit, but again, you can slightly go over it, but not entirely. Alright, now that we're done with the finer strokes, I'm switching to my size 4 brush. Again, you can see how I'm kind of holding my brush perpendicular to the paper, and then I'm just tapping my brush to create some dots of different sizes. Not entirely dots, I would say. They're not perfectly round, but they're just little splatters of brush strokes here and there, and that kind of creates that beautiful leaf effect. And you can see how I am focusing more on the areas around the textures that I just added first. And you can cover a lot of area using this color because this is your base color, and later on we will be adding different shades, bringing out the different highlights into my painting. So you're going to go ahead and create these dots. There's really not a lot to explain or do here. This process is very repetitive. So while you're at it, just think about trees. If I'm sure you've observed how trees are, how the leaves are, and how they flow. So these are certain things that you keep in mind when you're painting landscapes. You really kind of have to transform, or not transform, but like transport yourself to that location and just think about all the nature stuff that you've seen. So like trees, especially when I'm painting trees, I think about trees. I think about, oh, okay, so the branches look like that. Another thing that helps me is like clicking pictures of different trees, and I like to observe them. I like to look at the colors as well. the way in which the branches flow, and along with a lot of practice, that becomes very easy for you to paint. That becomes very free flowing to it, just comes naturally to it. So if you're someone who's passionate about landscape paintings, these are certain things that I do to help myself get in the mood of painting some landscape paintings and make them look a lot more natural, I would say, as compared to having very sharp strokes that don't really go with the flow of nature. And especially with trees, leaves, and things like that, which are very asymmetrical in nature. They don't, follow a particular order. They're very entirely unique, I would say. Very different. Not two trees look entirely the same. Their branch work and stuff is different. So that's something that comes with practice, and it just starts coming naturally to you once you've painted a lot of times, once you have had a bit of practice on your hands. So I have managed to cover most of the area with the brown color. Like I mentioned, that's going to be my main focus first, to create that, dots and leaf structure around the texture that I added. So the texture kind of plays an important role in the way that it creates that far off leaf effect, some fine leaf effects. And then the dots that I adds to it, it makes some leaves appear bigger. And you also have to vary in the sizes of the dots. So some are bigger, some are smaller. That kind of play comes in when you create these dots. Alright, so now that I'm almost done with this entire thing, I really like the way this looks, but what it's missing is color. So we're going to let this dry completely. And the next color that I'm using is a mix of my red shade with a bit of orange and brown. And I've just sped up the process here because we are creating dots again. So it's a repetitive process. We are just repeating the entire step that we did earlier, just with a different color. One thing to keep in mind when you are doing this is you don't have to entirely cover everything. So let's say you added 75% of the brown. So you want to add only like 50 or 40% of this red color. And then you have to vary. That's just almost like adding different shades of the color and creating variations of the color that you're seeing. So some are brown, some are red, some are going to be brighter, and that kind of shows the dying of the leaves, and eventually these leaves are going to fall down, right? And they go through that transitional phase in terms of color. So they turn yellow, they turn red, they turn brown, and eventually they kind of fall off. So that's something we are playing with, and that's how we'll create that effect in our painting as well. So we'll focus on different shades of the leaf colors. So I'm going with that beautiful reddish orange color here, tapping, tapping, tapping some strokes in, repetitive process. So just enjoy the process here. It's very repetitive, and it can also be very therapeutic when it comes to it, right? So don't think so much, just enjoy the process of creating this. I really like the way the red color is turning out. So once I'm done with this, I let it dry completely before moving on to the next color. So we've almost reached the end. The next color that I'm mixing is a lot more orange and a tiny amount of red in it. And this is just for highlight purposes. So you can see how the number of strokes that I'm making is very little, right? It does appear to be very, very little as compared to the previous strokes that I've made. But this adds to it so much. It creates that beautiful effect in that transitional phase. If you feel like the color is not shining out so much or standing out so much, you can add another layer. I might have to add another layer now that I'm thinking about it, because this orange is not as vibrant that I wanted it to. But then again, this is something that I decide as I go, right? So I really like the way it's coming along. I love how the variations of the strokes adds to the different shades of the autumn colors that appears on the tree, right? And sometimes with gouache, another thing that helps you understand the colors is that it might look darker when it's wet, it might dry lighter. And sometimes the lighter colors will dry darker. This again can be confusing, but comes to you when you paint a lot using the medium. And it's not as confusing, when you've done it a couple of times. I feel like I like the orange. It isn't as dark as I expected it to be. Now that it's drying out, to be lighter, and I don't want to add in any more lighter colors to it. So I guess we are good here. Once you're done adding these strokes, you're going to let this dry and peel the tape off. This probably has to be my favorite step of the whole painting process. Now, it sounds funny, but it is my favorite step because you get these clear edges. Since we did not get a lot of that good clear edges and some of the paints kind of seep through my edges, I'm going to just trim out those white edges that I'm seeing. So we are left with just the painting in the middle. But overall, I really like the way this has turned out. I love that transition between the mountains. You can see how there's that misty effect that I was talking about. The beautiful trees at the bottom, the branches coming in from the right side. Everything just looks so beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me in this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed the painting process and learned something new along the way. If you've painted along with me, don't forget to share your artworks under the handle The Simply Aesthetic on Instagram. So you can directly DM me your artworks, tag me in your posts, your stories, whatever fits you, because I would love to see your creations. And this is pretty much it from my side. I hope you have a lovely time ahead.